Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of The Depths. I'm joined this time by my brother, Thomas Carling, and we are discussing 48 Laws of Power by Robert Greene. This is a book that has attracted plenty of controversy and has been subject to a number of different interpretations, some of which are quite drastically different from one another. And so that made me feel that I should read it and try and get to grips with it, try and understand it on its own terms, and formulate my own opinion of it. It was a really interesting conversation, and I hope you enjoy it as well. But as it was recorded while I was on holiday, there are a couple of issues that arose. The first is that I didn't have all my equipment with me, and so I had to improvise some of the audio recording, which means the microphones are at very slightly different levels, and I'm not able to edit that after the fact. So hopefully it won't impact on the listening experience too much, but it frustrates me as the perfectionist editor that I am. And the other is that one of the video cameras cut out halfway through the conversation and we had to stop and restart, which is frustrating for two reasons. One is that it changed the tone of the conversation. We were coming towards the end anyway, but things got a bit more tangential after that, and we sort of lost the thread that we were following when it had been a really interesting conversation up until that point. The other is that, as regular viewers will know, I tend to not edit out any of the conversation. I try and make it as open and honest as possible. And there is a reason for that, because this podcast is created with an ethic behind it of open conversation and dialogue and of people being free to make mistakes. I'm not changing that ethic, and so I just want to clarify that the edit is because of the technical issue and not for any other reason. I'm not trying to manipulate the conversation or how it's represented in any way, shape, or form. And I will continue to be committed to these conversations being as open and having as much room for error as is needed to have productive and meaningful conversations. So, without any further delays, I invite you to join me and to join Tom on a little dive into the depths of power with Robert Greene as our guide and into the depths of 48 Laws of Power. So, first things first, how was your first ice bath experience?
It wasn't too bad. Putting my head under was kind of horrible, but other than that, it's like my fingers still feel a bit numb. But like other than that, I survived.
You survived. You didn't put your head the whole way under, though.
I missed like the very crown of my head, and it like the rest of me was wet, so it's fine by my standard.
Well, for a first attempt, it's not bad.
I mean, for doing 4 minutes for a first attempt anyway is like,
yeah,
that's good enough. And
4 minutes at 4 degrees, 5 degrees, so it's a good start.
To be fair, it's more than 4 minutes as well, because it's like I'm not starting it till your head's gone under. So I was in there for like 15 seconds first.
I think you'd be surprised at how little time passed in that period.
Yeah, 15 seconds might be a stretch. At least 5, though. You got to give me that.
So, 48 Laws of Power.
Yeah.
What do you think that Robert Greene was trying to achieve with this book? Because I've heard different interpretations from different people, so I'm curious as to what you made of it.
Well, it's kind of hard not to have my opinion influenced by everything I've read online by it. So, like, the things that I've heard is one is that it's the Narcissistic Handbook, and then I've also listened to a podcast with Robert Greene on it, and he was saying about how it is equally for people trying to understand people making power plays and stuff like that on them, as much as it is like learning how to make power plays. Now, after reading that book and having both those conflicting opinions in my mind, I think Narcissistic Handbook is a lot more realistic. Because it very much focuses on obviously how to gain power over people and stuff like that is the whole point of the book. But there's not really many other perspectives other than the person trying to enforce power. Like there's con men and there's a lot of like kings and queens and stuff like that throughout the book, and it's just loads of like very small stories of all these power plays and things throughout history. And it's very much geared towards how to gain power and how to maintain it, and not from any other perspective other than the person that's doing it, except for like one or two bits. So I don't believe Robert Greene's honest with what his intentions were, or at least not consciously honest.
Okay, yeah. I think so. When I first started reading this book, I was introduced to it by someone, because I'd heard about it and I'd heard the common perception that it's a psychopath's handbook.
Yeah.
And I can see the sort of grounds for that argument being made. And there's this line in the preface that ends the preface, in the concise version at least, and says, by putting them into practice, you will be able to thrive in the modern world, appearing the paragon of decency while being the consummate manipulator. So it certainly portrays itself as a guide for how to accumulate and maintain power.
Yeah.
I guess one of the interesting questions, and I'm curious as to what your views are on this, how do you interpret his definition of power? What do you see him as referring to when he says power?
Has he stated a definition?
No,
I don't know. So
that there isn't a clear stated definition.
So what do I think he's sort of referring to as power? I think power is very much the ability to guide and influence people in directions that you want to guide them in. So like I suppose there's going to be different levels to it, really, isn't there? There's going to be a level of power which is subtly sort of manipulating people into getting things that you want and being able to control situations, and then there's blatant like force of power and things like that, which would then come into aspects in terms of like wars and things like that. So ensuring that you have an overall like power of someone else in a sense.
Okay, so you see it as the ability to coerce and manipulate others.
Yeah, I'd say that in like a subtle sense, and then obviously you've got like the more brutal sense of like, I suppose, I want to say physical power, but it wouldn't really translate into that. Well, it would, but I don't really know how to describe it.
You would, I think you can probably divide the laws within the book as to how they operate.
Yeah.
And I think this is what you're getting at, into those which compel and those which manipulate. So the compulsion would sort of be a threat of force, or, you know, when there's rules like destroy your enemy completely, or I can't remember exactly how he phrased it, but it was something to that effect.
Yeah.
That would be an example of overt compulsion, rather than a more subtle manipulation.
Yeah.
Is that sort of categorization roughly what you were getting
at? I think that's pretty much exactly how I would have worded it if I had the words.
I think that I don't think he uses exactly the same definition of power throughout.
No.
Because I think he So I would consider the compulsion and coercion aspect power, but I also think at times he's just talking about social status, where it's like being in a position to influence and make decisions.
Yeah. So that would definitely be a big element of a lot of the laws that he puts in there.
Yeah, I have the book here, so because this is so one of the. I don't know if you ever came across Ray Dalio's Principles,
I don't think so.
but I was recommended to listen to it as an audiobook by someone a while ago. And I can't remember how many of the principles there were, but I had the same problem as I had with this, which is when you get over a certain number, it becomes very difficult to remember them all. And
Yeah.
so a list of that many items almost seems redundant. You have
Yeah.
to choose laws that you want to remember and consider for some reason.
Yeah, I ended up having to go back over because at the start of the book they have like a kind of like the concise version of the book, but they have like a each law with a very small definition of it underneath. So I went back over that and I was reading through them. And I was like, I did not remember half of these. The thing that made me remember them more is the stories that were attached to them rather than the actual laws themselves. So like the stories that gripped me more tend to be the ones that I remember more.
Okay, because I listened to it as audiobook first, and then I've gone through the concise version to make that up. And one of the things that I actually found difficult in the audiobook was the stories, because I found that the stories were a bit too convoluted and not always, they didn't always seem directly relevant to the law. So at
Yeah.
times I was like, okay, I might say miss the law because the law is just one sentence because I'm driving or something like that. My mind's
Yeah.
elsewhere, and I miss that, and then I'm listening to this story and trying to extrapolate what the law is from that, and going, I have no idea.
Yeah, you don't. If you forget the law of the chapter that you're reading on, it's not until it comes back to like either the reversal section or the interpretation bit after the story that it's like, right, okay, that makes sense. Because I think the reason for some of that is the fact that the story, the power play within the story can sometimes be quite subtle and not like obvious in a sense. So you'll like read through it and then it'll come to the interpretation and then it explains how the power play sort of played out. And it's like, okay, you can see that now, but when I was reading through it, I was sort of reading like, what's the point of this story? And it's sort of, yeah, I think that's sort of the subtleness of some of them.
Yeah. So I'm curious then if you feel that the list was hard to remember, but the stories made it more memorable, whether whichever way you sort of interpret the author's intentions, whether that is to give people a guide to a sort of psychopathic power drive, or whether it is to give someone the ammunition to be alert and awake to the potential for other people making power plays.
Yeah.
we, do you feel he sort of did a good job of tooling you for either of those? Um, if one more than the other, or
Ah, yeah, without a doubt, one more than the other. It's going to be way more leaning towards actually performing the power plays than like being aware of them. Um,
so did he do a good job of that?
yes and no. I think yes, in the sense of he explained many different elements to all these powers and stuff like that. Some of the chapters were very long, and he went into detail of how different scenarios sort of manifest them in like different ways and stuff like that. Um, but no, in the sense of I think anyone who's going to be using these laws and stuff like that is going to need to read this book several times to actually remember them and be able to implement them in real life. I think one of the biggest issues that I have with this book that I know came up quite a few times with people online is the fact that um, he says many times that it applies to modern life, but there were very little examples that the average person would be able to use. Like, it's all very high status people like kings, queens, all that sort of stuff. People commanding wars, like generals, all those things. Not your average person. Like, the majority of the people that read this book aren't really gonna have a good idea of how to implement them in real life, which is probably a good thing if you think about it, because you don't really want a load of psychopaths walking around with a book telling them how to be even more of a prick. But yeah, I think he did a good job in some sense, but overall, I don't think it's really that applicable in most scenarios, unless you can go through it with a fine comb and pick out like little sections like I did, and I was like, right, I could apply that to parts of my life. Like one of them about like saying less than needed and not letting people know your plans and things like that. And there's quite a few things about courting people as well. So like in terms of relationships and stuff like that, you can definitely use these things. Not that I would recommend it. But yeah, overall, like I think it could have been written better, but in a sense, if he wrote it better in those senses, then he probably would have been absolutely like destroyed, because everyone would be like, right, now this is a narcissist handbook or psychopath handbook, essentially.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying there in terms of I think it could be. It's difficult because on the one hand, I think the stories gave it salience. You know, they gave the point some sort of grounding in
Yeah,
a reality and made it more memorable. From what you were saying earlier, I do think that I think to some degree how successful he was probably depends on the reader, because
yeah,
some people are better at extrapolating information from one situation to another
yeah,
in a way that isn't necessarily obvious to everyone. And I think that one of the comparisons that I'm instantly tempted to make, for obvious reasons, particularly because it's referenced within the book several times, is Sun Tzu's Art of War,
yeah,
because that was written by a Chinese emperor that may or may not have existed, um, and was entirely about military strategy.
yeah,
So, in theory, has very little application outside of that, but is also very well regarded and referenced by people in all sorts of different situations, whether it's businessmen, whether it's music artists, whether, you know,
yeah,
I've come across a load of scenarios where that has been referenced as a sort of inspiration or guidance to people. So when I think of this book in those terms, I think that it could be something that, yes, you're unlikely to remember all 48 laws off the top of your head, but if you read through it once and then use it as a reference and sort of come back to it every so often, it
yeah,
could be a source of inspiration when you're dealing with challenging situations, um, particularly if you were in a context where there is competition at play.
yeah. I think much more when you're leaning towards like business world and things like that. I think that's where it's going to be a lot more relevant in a sense. Uh,
Mm.
when you, yeah, I don't know. I suppose you could apply some of it in terms of other competitive senses like sports and things like that, especially like team sports. I suppose if you really boil that down, that's not too dissimilar to war, especially like the mental games of it and stuff like that. Especially if you start looking at ice hockey, because that's pretty brutal. Um,
Or combat sports where you are very almost
good.
literally going to war every time you're in there. It's just a on one war.
I don't know. Have you seen some of the newer fighting they're doing of like a fat geezer and like two women and fighting and stuff like that in
I
like Russia
saw
and
that, and I
stuff like that.
saw Eddie Hall fought two much smaller people than himself.
Yeah,
And there's also, think it was Russian or Polish. There was, you can find them on YouTube, but at one point they were doing 5v5 MMA matches. And so if one person got knocked out, then it's 5v4, and it would
yeah.
almost always end with like 3 or 4 people just stomping on one person. It was pretty brutal.
That's Russia for you. It's a good representation of the rest of their history as well, I guess.
Cancelled. So you started to touch on it a second ago, but where are the places you feel this has taught you to act different or sort of like changed it? What are the rules that you've sort of come away with going, I could apply those in a different situation, or actually I would adjust my position?
Rule 26, keeping my hands clean.
Keeping your hands clean.
Yeah.
This one, I can't help but compare this one to the 10 Crack Commandments.
Wait, which bit of the 10 Crack Commandments?
Never hold no weight on you.
Yeah.
I can't remember the next line without going through the whole song, but it's basically saying that the people who work for you can do the dirty work.
Yeah. Well, I was more taking it in a literal sense and just remembering to wash my hands more often and COVID and all that. Even though that was 4 years ago now. Hardly relevant.
Depends who you are.
Yeah. I've written quite a few here, but I can't read my own handwriting.
Well, could you pick up the book so that you're talking into the mic?
That probably makes sense. Rather than staring at the floor and looking away from the mic. I just didn't want it to look too, I don't know, informal, I guess. But
Formal, you mean? It would be more formal.
yeah, that's a good point. So my first rule is learning English. 5, so much depends on your reputation, guard it with your life. Most of these ones that I've written down are very much me thinking about, because I've had business plans that I want to pursue at some point when I have the money to do so. And I think a lot of the things that I've read in this book that I start thinking about, that I'm like, I could apply that to my life and things like that, much more when I would either be in the public eye or working with teams of people and stuff like that. So the reputation one sort of wraps around your whole life really, when you start being someone of influence or someone who's building a business, sort of having customers and stuff like that. Because if you don't have a good reputation, or if your reputation's soiled, your employers aren't going to like follow you. They're not going to like look up to you. They're not going to, I mean, most people don't look up to their employers anyway, but yeah, it comes into play with that. It comes into play with customers, like obviously the whole cancel culture over the last few years.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you about, because you're sort of saying about protecting it. How does this reputation management work in your mind, and how do you balance that with the tendency of people to threaten reputation destruction as a means of coercing, or actually, interestingly, you could say, when you're talking about how this book enables you to identify psychopathic behavior or power plays by other people, what you've just made the connection with between cancel culture and the rule about protecting your reputation gives you an indication that people who will attack people's reputation are making a power play.
Oh yeah, they're 100% doing that. That's the whole. That's just basically what online is. Like, if you think about it, is people don't call other people out because they genuinely think they're like immoral and things like that. They call other people out because if they bring other people down, they're bringing themselves up. You know, it's like the whole world of social media is this constant power plays, and people will say it's not. People will be like, "Oh, I'm just posting this because like I want the world to see it and stuff like that." But like, okay, fair enough. But at the same time, you want likes, you want to be seen, you want people to know that you're doing these things. Because if people don't know you're doing these things, it doesn't matter. You're not elevating your status in that sense. Um, what was the original question?
So the original question was about this law and how you would put it into action, but then I was asking about how you balance that with the propensity of other people to threaten reputation destruction in order to gain leverage. So, say if you had a business, and you're considering your reputation as an important part of your business plan, and you have to protect that, how do you balance that with the fact that you also want to speak your mind and be honest and not be sort of browbeat by the mob into adopting positions that you don't necessarily hold?
This it's a difficult one because I don't think it's so much about protecting your reputation and things like that in that sense. Or no, it is, but how do I word this? It's kind of like you need a game plan. If you're going into business around these things, you need a game plan because it's not about avoiding people cancelling you. It's about being consistent with your message towards your target audience to ensure that if your reputation is damaged by people who disagree with you, it will increase your reputation with the people who agree with you, or the people or the target audience that you're aiming for. If your target audience is very much left wing, then doing things to upset cancel culture isn't going to push you. But if you're leaning towards right wing or moderate, then sometimes leaning into people cancelling you can help and things like that. So it's very much having a game plan about how you are going to manage your reputation in the eyes of your target audience. There's actually a really good example of this of some woman on TikTok recently who basically just she was doing like a baking video or something like that, and she used the N-word. She said like all these women basically dating like broadcast,
Yeah.
and she very quickly got swarmed by it. She had like no followers beforehand, like no one picked up on it for like a month, and then she got absolutely swarmed by it, and everyone started sharing it. It's like cancel her, and then obviously all these other people were just like, oh no, it's fine. Like she's just using it in a way that any other people would use it. Like a lot of black people started coming to her defense and being like, well, it doesn't really matter, like, does it? And she got boosted massively, and now she's getting loads of interviews. And then she posted on Twitter after like about a month of all this going on, I think, and she was just like, thank you for all the puppets who played into my hand. I am now launching my career in conservative media. And she's now got a massive following because she got those people to play into her game of basically promoting her by trying to cancel her. And I think people are stupid, us as well. Like everyone's stupid, and we're very easily manipulated by our emotions. So you need to understand like where the trends are in how people are thinking. Like everyone's sort of, as soon as you get into a sort of group of people, you will have similar thoughts and stuff like that. And if you know how to play those groups basically like a fiddle, you can get them to do exactly what you want, and you're able to boost your social media engagement and all that stuff just through knowing people, in a sense.
So you would say that the reputation management also involves it involves some level of discernment as to where your reputation will be valuable and
Yeah,
where it will be less valuable, and to utilize you can almost utilize attacks on your reputation in you can sort of redirect them to boost your reputation in where you feel it's valuable.
yeah, exactly. Like you could, it's kind of like a game of sacrifice, isn't it? Like, say you're playing chess. If there's a move that you can make that sacrifices your queen, but then puts them in a position where you're able to checkmate them with your other pieces, then it's a good move. So, like, if you sacrifice some of your reputation with the people that you aren't really trying to target, but it boosts your reputation with the people that you are trying to target,
Hmm.
it's, yeah, it's a win-win.
Yeah, I think that I completely agree with your sort of response to it. I think the only thing I would probably highlight is that there are right wing versions of cancel culture as well, and it's not necessarily a partisan
Yeah, no,
thing.
that's
That
true.
I mean, certainly in the '90s, early 2000s, it was the sort of right wing Christians who were trying to censor music and television and things like that more.
Yeah.
It's just seems to have flipped on its head in terms of who's getting the most attention with their cancel culture attempts.
Oh, this is what I mean. Like, it's very much you need to understand the group thought of that time, because like the tactics that you're using now with social media, if you used it when social media first started, it wouldn't work. So
Mm.
you need to be very aware and I suppose confident in the psychology of the current average like social media user and stuff like that. I suppose it's not even specifically average. It's just uh, the average social media user of the area that you're trying to target or manipulate, in a sense.
Yeah, and I think that I think there's something about this where when you start to adopt the language of power or the language used in this book, it almost becomes somewhat more nefarious in the way that it sounds.
Yeah,
Whereas if you were talking about maximizing sort of your target audience, maximizing audience
yeah,
and search engine optimization and customer satisfaction and things like that, then it would sound like economics and business modeling, and it wouldn't sound as inherently nefarious as when you talk about it as sort of manipulation and reputation and things like that. So that I do think that part of the negative reaction to this book might be based on the conceptual sort of lens that like the linguistic lens that it
yeah,
adopts.
yeah. I 100% agree with you on that, because if you look throughout, uh, I would say throughout history, but like much more towards um, last like 100 years or so, if you look at business tactics and stuff like that and marketing tactics, it is all just manipulation, but it's all covered up with like fancy words and stuff like that, just to make it normalized. Like the current or the marketing of like movie stars and all that sort of stuff, it's very much trying to get people to manipulate people into idolizing these people, um, to get as much engagement out of them as possible. But you would never say that. You'd be like, "Ah, oh, we're just creating influence," and
Yeah,
influence, power, hand in hand. But you wouldn't say, I don't know, Ashton Kutcher, Ashton Kutcher.
yeah,
Yeah, that's how you pronounce it. You wouldn't say that he's like a really powerful man or something like that, would you? You'd just say that he's famous. Like it's
yeah,
very much how you word it, and I think if you think about it, they probably started adapting a lot of these words to make it more susceptible to the average human ear, if you know what I mean.
So I think that your use of the term influence there in comparison to power goes back to sort of the point I was making earlier on, because I would say that power, that if I was to distinguish power from influence, I would say that influence is far more along the lines of status. It's like people, because influence could come from people looking up to you and admiring you and viewing you as someone to emulate in some regard.
Yeah.
Whereas power doesn't have that connotation to me, and power would be more about the compulsion element of it. So I think that there is a difference. I don't know if it's always separated conceptually, and I think sometimes people conflate the two, or often people probably conflate the two. I think this book probably conflates the two quite often, and I think that people interpreting this book have probably adopted that same conflation, because if we're talking about influence, okay, there are some people who will object to hierarchies as a concept,
Yeah.
but that doesn't make sense in a social situation anyway, because there are always going to be people who have more influence. In a friendship group, you don't necessarily have people who are above or below people. You don't have a formalized hierarchical structure,
No.
but you will have people who other people are more likely to follow, who if they make a suggestion it's more likely to be heard than others,
Yeah.
or who can court more attention generally within that group. That there are sort of natural emergent social hierarchies within any group of people,
Yeah. 100%.
and that is in a healthy group usually based on more on sort of influence and status than it is on power, because it's not by compulsion. It's sort of a dispersed network of sort of interactions between people, and that's just the property of that emerges.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of like a Venn diagram, and I think influence and power cross over significantly, but there's they're obviously not the same thing, but they do have a significant overlap. Essentially, like you can't really have power without influence. Like you need to be able to influence people, even if it's just people within your social circle. So maybe you could look at it as like influence is an element of power, just like one element of power, and then you got like others. I suppose that comes back to exactly what we were saying at the start. But yeah,
I think the Venn diagram analogy is sort of the one that makes most sense, or the image of the Venn diagram, because I think there is influence without the exertion of power, and there is power without the healthy version of influence. Like you can have power that's pure compulsion, and you can have influence that's purely out of admiration, and sort of organic social status. But there is a crossover there where, and I think that it's probably a spectrum as well, right? Where you know, it's not just this is power or this is influence. It's like some things involve a higher level of compulsion than others. Because if you were to say, look at compulsion or coercion as the potential for a negative being inflicted on you were you not to adhere to something, then you could say that the potential for your friend getting upset if you don't sort of agree to a request that they're making, then that could be defined as power, and that wouldn't be that would just be an organic sort of social interaction, because people have emotional attachments to the requests that they make, and people are going to have a response to getting an answer, whether it's the one that they want or not, if they have a desired outcome.
Is that still not power though? Because if you think about it, like your power to influence other people's emotion is still even like it's still a power, and like it's just significantly, yeah, like you said, on the spectrum, it's like a significantly lesser sort of power.
Yeah.
So yeah, I don't know. It's a weird one when you start thinking about it in terms of like friendship groups and stuff like that, because there's definitely like I see it within my own friendship groups. There's definitely people who are sort of like the center, and people who sort of gravitate that around that one person who will have influence on what we're going to do and stuff like that. Um, and you wouldn't like to see it as power. You wouldn't like to look at it and be like, oh, that person's like the powerful one in the group, the one that sort of like uh, guides and make decisions and sort of has control over it. But like if you look at it and boil it down to a very black and white sort of view of it, it is like people definitely have power over their friends and stuff like that. But when you say the word power, it just sounds fucking horrible. Like it does. But yeah, it's a weird dynamic or a weird thing to think about.
Yeah, and I think that the example I was giving was deliberately a lower end of what. So it's sort of like a test case of what would be considered the exercise of power, and what is just influence, and what is just organic dynamic. Because I think that there's been a real focus on power as a concept in the last 20 years or so, more so in the last 10, arising from, the sort of Marxist postmodernist philosophy where power is sort of considered the ultimate defining aspect of human relationships.
Yeah.
But I often find that when you talk about power in those terms, you make things too simple and black and white, and there's so many other aspects to human relationships that power seems insufficient to capture all of that. And that's why there is a way of defining almost everything as power. I remember I was reading Judith Butler recently, and she objects fundamentally to categorization, basically, because her point is any sort of category excludes whatever is not in that category. And
right, that makes sense considering.
Yeah, that's how you define categories.
Yeah.
And it makes sense when I understand the point she's getting at when she's sort of saying, if you define straight, then you are by definition painting the gay as other compared to the straight. But you also have the inverse of that, where when you define gay, you're relative to gay as a definition, then straight is another. And she's sort of saying that these labels are exclusive, and she's right, but it also means that if you were to take that to its logical conclusion, then you erode the ability to use language, because every word only refers to something by virtue of not referring to everything else. And so that's where I find, that's an example of her sort of saying there is an inherent power dynamic within just categorization itself. And you can paint it that way, but I think it's not helpful to think of that in terms of power. I think that particularly if you come with an a priori assumption that power is inherently negative and should always be addressed, and we should always be seeking to remove any aspect of power within it.
Yeah, see, that kind of reminds me of something that I was reading a while ago about raising kids and things like that. And one of the things they said is as soon as you start to praise your child, you're putting yourself in a position of power over them, and praising is just going to make them dependent on you to keep getting your approval and things like that. And I was reading it, and I was like, right, that makes sense, but you do have a position of power. You're their parent. And although maybe excessive praise could be negative and things like that, to basically be like, don't praise your child at all because you're putting yourself in a position of power over your child, and sort of just congratulate them on XYZ or whatever, and just like trying to shift these very minor dynamics around raising your child to try and ensure that you're not an authority figure over them and stuff like that. It does make sense. There is like there's obviously going to be a power dynamic to you and your family and your kids and stuff like that, because that's just how it works. If you don't have power over your kid, it just doesn't make any sense whatsoever. But yeah, it's just it is very much, you can look at anything as power, but if you start doing that, you're just going to end up in this sort of downward spiral of everyone's sort of an asshole because like
I also think that one of the things that should be acknowledged that I don't think is acknowledged by people who would reject this book because they're like, oh, it's inappropriate to attempt to exercise power because power is inherently wrong. So people who sort of come from that position to begin with, a position I understand, but I think that one of the issues with rejecting the concept of power is that you therefore, because you're almost saying power isn't an acceptable thing and we'll get rid of it, it automatically puts you in a position where you're going to be blind to your own sort of power plays. And one of the things that it presumes is in doing that is that all power plays are sort of conscious and calculated, which I don't think they are. I think a lot more of social dynamics and human interaction is unconscious and emotionally driven than people recognize. And I think about one of the conversations I had with John a little while ago about Bad Men by David Buss, which was an evolutionary psychology perspective on domestic abuse and sexual coercion and so on. And that involved a lot of sort of subconscious, how does domestic abuse sort of occur? And it would be like, well, it is a mate guarding strategy effectively where you sort of worry that there's a risk of you losing your partner, and so you take action to reduce the risk of them going elsewhere, and so on and so forth. And I don't think anyone thinks about it like that, but when you look at the data, it appears to play out like that, and people act as if that's what they're thinking, even if none of them could articulate it to you in the moment if you were to ask them what they were doing. And this is a real challenge in human behavior, and this is where psychoanalysis sort of comes from, and a lot of the sort of psychodynamic theories and all the other models of counselling as well, which are largely or of therapy, which are largely based around the presupposition that you don't always know yourself or what you're doing, and that talking to someone else about it will help you to understand yourself better.
Yeah.
So with that in mind, did you read this book and find any rules where you sort of thought, that actually, I recognize that in my own behavior previously?
Yeah. And I think the one that I really mastered was 46. Never appear too perfect. I've got that one right on the dot.
Yeah.
No, but to be fair, there is actually example from my own life that sort of applies to. I'm not sure if this is the best rule to go by it, but I remember when I started working somewhere, and I was basically working with someone else, and this person had been there for a while before me, and then basically I had strengths that, like, in communication it was better than their strength in communication, but they had like better tactical skills, and basically I was able to like articulate everything, and then that made them sort of get annoyed with me. And since I was able to communicate like issues with the person, like our manager, it ended up with some weird sort of power dynamic where they would sort of try and push their knowledge around the whole technical side of things on me and sort of make me feel like less in that area by making comments on me doing things wrong and stuff like that. And then getting sort of arsey when I would be able to play to my strengths and communicate things more effectively. And when I read that one, it kind of made me realise how that dynamic played out, because originally I was just thinking, wow, that person's a bit of an asshole. But I didn't realise that me being able to do something better than them would have that sort of influence. And I think, I'm not sure if I got it written down or not, but I think there's another one that is very another rule that's very similar to that. It's something to do with don't appear smarter than your mark, or like always be dumber than your mark, or something like that.
Law 21, play a sucker to catch a sucker, seem dumber than your mark.
Yeah. So I'm not sure if that really applies because they weren't my mark. But
yeah, it's a similar thing. And there was another one very early on that played into it. In fact, law number 1 is never outshine the master.
Yeah.
And I think there is They all are variations on a theme, which is basically that insecurity can be triggered in other people, and other people's insecurity can be detrimental to you if you do not conduct yourself in a way that allows them to feel secure. And sometimes their security relies on them having at least an illusion of superiority over you. And I can think of a few different examples where the never appear too perfect one has played out in my life. And a couple of those have been within relationships or within the sort of early courting phases, where I guess I've probably made a mistake in not openly articulating the things, my own imperfections. To me, they appeared very obvious and almost like, why would I have to point these things out? But when I've been with someone who's maybe more prone to insecurity and who is maybe their sort of emotional regulation is more apparently challenged in some ways, where they might be prone to getting quite upset or anxious in situations. And I know from a million different situations I've been in and feedback from other people that I seem to be pretty level-headed and calm throughout every situation, and there isn't a huge outward emotional register. And so I think sometimes people have not recognized situations where I'm scared or where I'm upset or where I'm stressed or finding things difficult. And I've had the response when I've sort of questioned someone's reaction to something, and they've sort of said, oh, because you're just so perfect, or you're not as perfect as you think you are. And I've been taken aback by it a little bit, because I've gone, where did you get the impression that I think I'm perfect? Because I think I'm incredibly flawed.
Yeah, I was going to say, try living around you for a few years and then they'll start to realise. I think I think that's very much an issue with most people, but especially in relationships, is as soon as one person starts to think that they're beneath you in the relationship in one way or another, if they're not able to accept that relationships aren't always 50-50, because obviously there's this massive narrative that relationships should be entirely equal all the time and stuff like that, and people should be sort of like on the same level and stuff. If people hold that belief, and if people can't recognize that you're both going to have different strengths and weaknesses and stuff like that, and they will start getting insecure if they feel like there's a different sort of power dynamic there. And it's weird though, because you would have thought that, or you come across a lot of women wanting sort of a man who is somewhat stoic and things like that. So to get upset by those sorts of things seems a bit odd, but I guess everyone's different. So like,
Yeah. Well, the example that I'm thinking of most, and you sort of alluded to the dynamic that emerged, was when I was in a relationship with someone. They went through a particularly difficult time emotionally, and during that period became incredibly dependent on me.
yeah,
Um, and I was having to do a lot of stuff for them that I wouldn't typically have had to do. And what very clearly happened was they almost built up a resentment towards me based on the fact that they were dependent on me, and it was almost like they resented me for not having the same struggles as them, and that they thought that was somehow unfair. It was really a strange dynamic. Um, but it does sort of speak to that insecurity that people can feel if they feel that they're beneath someone. And I completely agree with you that the idea that a relationship is 50-50 is naive, because it'll be 50-50 at its best points, but the probability that both of you are functioning at the same level all the time or at the
yeah,
same time is very, very low. It's
yeah,
very likely that, yes, if one of you is having a difficult time, the other person's probably impacted by that. So you're probably both slightly below optimum for that period. But the probability is that, one of you's just lost their job, or one of you's just missed out on a promotion or something important to them, or one of you's just lost their parent or their friend or whatever. There's always idiosyncrasies within that relationship that mean that each of you is going to be going through different things at different times, and sometimes that involves the other person stepping up to sort of take the slack, and sometimes it involves the other person just sort of keep on ticking on to make sure that things don't fall apart while you're getting yourself back on track.
yeah. It makes you question why because obviously they do teach psychology in some schools and stuff like that, but teaching relationship dynamics and emotional intelligence and things like that in schools will probably make people a lot more capable to like live life, because I think it is just a massive lack of understanding how we sort of react to our emotions, how our emotions dictate our behaviors and stuff like that. If you don't have an understanding of like your emotions and how they'll impact you and how they'll impact your behaviors and the other person that you're in a relationship with and things like that, then you're basically destined for failure. And I think so many people in modern days, just especially in the dating pool, just don't have emotional intelligence like, at all. It seems very at all is probably a bit unfair.
Yeah.
Just reflecting on my own words as I'm saying that, but yeah, it seems weird, but at the same time, I think there's also an element of well, it's all going to come from family issues and stuff like that, like family dynamics and stuff like that. You're going to pick up your emotional intelligence and stuff from those things, and as people are having less and less intact households, then it's probably just going to get worse and worse, isn't it?
Well, this is sort of when you said about schools. I'm not convinced that schools are necessarily the right people to be dealing with that, because I think it's very limited to what schools can be doing. And I think that I've just finished reading Abigail Schreier's Bad Therapy, and she touched on a similar subject where it's like social emotional learning and things like that being brought into school. There's sort of two issues. One is that they tend to be they tend to get ideologically hijacked very quickly.
Yeah, that's true.
And I know that James Lindsay, for example, has spoken a lot about the social emotional learning programs and how they've been often relied very heavily on Marxist and neo-Marxist philosophy as their sort of basis, and they are used to introduce Marxist ideas under the guise of something progressive. At the same time, what Abigail Schreier was talking about is how a lot of these social emotional learning, they encourage children to sort of reflect on their emotions, and it almost becomes rumination, where you're
Right.
talking about your emotions constantly. And actually, one of the things that builds resilience is the ability at times to suppress your emotions and to not allow them to sort of dictate you.
Yeah.
And at the same time, when you sort of made two comparisons there, where you were like, they will learn a lot of their dynamics in terms of how relationships should function and how they should manage their emotions to be in relationships from home, which I completely agree with. I think there's a risk where if you start to talk about those, heavily emphasize those things in school, then school, one, sort of parents will abdicate, some parents will abdicate responsibility and leave it to the school to teach them. But you're going to highlight those kids who don't have the dynamic that school are saying they should do, and that's going to cause them to sort of question their family dynamic. And rather than recognizing that all families have their own dynamic and there's a lot of idiosyncrasy and uniqueness to that, and valuing that, they're going to sort of be saying, well, school said my family dynamic's really unhealthy, and maybe that's something I need to worry about, and that's going to have an adverse impact on them. And the other thing is that when you look at what sort of, so one of the things that people would most often talk about when they're talking about relationship styles is attachment styles.
Yeah.
And the research from that, to my knowledge, and I've spent quite a bit of time reading on the subject, hasn't done a very good job yet of discerning between how much of attachment is genetic and how much of it's environmental. Because if you're raised by two parents who are sort of chaotic in their attachment styles, who are maybe anxious or avoidant, then the child turns out to be anxious or avoidant and mimic that pattern of relating to other people.
Yeah.
There's often an assumption where people go, oh, well, that must be because they've learned how to interact with people based on these relationships. And that no doubt will have an element of influence, but there's also, they could be like that because their parents were like that, and that could just be genetic. So it's very hard to disentangle those things.
And you start separating twins and things like that.
Yeah, which becomes unethical. So you have to find organic situations where that can arise, and there is reason from twin studies to believe that at least a portion, probably a sizable portion of attachment styles is genetic rather than environmental.
That's weird though, because that means that your genetics are essentially dictating your thought patterns and things like that, which I would have thought that I would have thought that your thoughts would be almost entirely like environmental and the things that have kind of like happened to you and things like that, because like I don't, to be fair, I know next to nothing about genetics, so like I'm not the person to be talking about this.
So let me give you an example, and let's see if it makes things a little bit clearer. If you a lot of your temperament is passed down through genetics. So twin studies vary a little bit in what they illustrate for this, but it would say usually genetics is about 50%. Shared environment, which is your home environment, is 0 to 10%, and then 40 to 50% comes from unique environment. So that would be environment you don't share with your siblings. So it'd be school, clubs, peer group, things like that, things that you're doing separate from the household.
Yeah.
So there's a social element and a genetic element there. If you say the specifics of your thoughts are probably going to be influenced heavily by social reality.
Yeah.
For example, I mean, we don't think in language, but we tend to think in a sort of, we have sort of like a conceptual, or it's not even quite an image, it's sort of like a blurry concept in our head that we then refine into an image that we then translate into words. Because if you think about it, there's often times where you can't find the words to convey what you're thinking. And that's because you're not thinking in words. Because if you were thinking in words, the words would be there already.
But I don't know. I think more in words than image. They're different people think in images and words.
But I'm not saying that you see a clear image. But when you say think about a concept, you have like an idea in your mind, but it's not refined into words straight away.
I have like a voice in my head as soon as I start thinking of stuff. I hear words and it like.
All right. Well, let's not get too tangented into this, but but an example would be part of that thought process is mediated by language, and obviously the language that comes out in is going to be completely culturally relevant, because I speak English because I was born in England and raised in Ireland. If I was raised in Germany, I would speak German. You know, that's just a very obvious cultural difference. But actually, the languages hold something in common because they refer to something that existed before the language, and the language had to refer to it.
Yeah, I see what you mean now.
So, while the language is different, the sort of things that it's referring to pre-existing, sorry. And if you think about like what you actually think about, if you are someone who's an anxious person who thinks about like how things could go wrong and so on and so forth, people probably experience those same thoughts. Like, I'm not a very anxious person, but I still have the thoughts of how something could go wrong. But how loud those thoughts are in my head is going to be predetermined by my genetic temperament, which sort of leans me towards anxiety. Certain events in my life could emphasize that even further or mute it slightly. It's almost like you're playing a game, you know, something like chess. There are loads and loads of moves you can make in chess. It's an unbelievably complicated game, and that's almost like the social aspect. But there are preset rules, and those rules are almost analogous to the genetic complex. It's like your brain has come with a certain temperament and a certain predisposition that makes certain things more likely and less likely than others, and then the social environment colours in the details of that.
All right, okay. Yeah, that makes sense. That was a good way of putting it, I reckon. Don't really have much else to say about it, but yeah, thank you for explaining.
It's fine. So that was talking about, I can't remember. I'm trying to trace back through our steps.
We started talking about rules that I have used.
Oh, we were talking about relationships, weren't we?
Yeah, because we were talking about never be too perfect.
Yeah.
Do you want me to throw out another one that I've used?
Yeah, go on.
Think as you like, but behave as others. So it's essentially saying that speaking your mind, if you think differently too much, can have a detrimental impact to the way people view you, because people will start to so like the whole like tribal aspect of like everyone has like a groupthink kind of thing, and like if you start going against that grain, then people are going to start reacting negatively to you. So it's essentially saying that blending in will be more beneficial for you to then sort of coerce your ideas into the whole dynamic of things, and yeah, essentially just act like you're thinking the same way and sort of use that to your benefit because you fit in. And I noticed most of these things that I've used have been very much more like recent years, because when I was younger I was just like, I just am who I am, people just have to deal with it sort of thing, which wasn't a healthy way of doing it, but I went through a load of stuff that sort of brought me to where I am, so it doesn't really matter. But yeah, very much just like I used to always try and force my opinions into people's sort of into conversations that I have with my friends, and kind of felt that I knew better and things like that. And like realistically, most of the time I probably didn't. But now it's sort of, I very much keep my opinions to myself a lot of the time, unless it's very much necessary or I feel comfortable enough to do that without the friction of other people being like just getting annoyed at it, essentially. Because it's kind of like, I would reframe it more as I have a lot more value in terms of my peace of mind than I do of being right.
Hmm.
So yeah, that one sort of falls together.
I think that's quite a common developmental pathway where people, when they're younger, particularly in late adolescence, develop the idea that they understand the world far better than they do.
Yeah.
Piaget wrote about it and basically said that there's a sort of egocentric phase where in late adolescence where people get grand ideas about the world, but it's still very much focused on themselves as the originator of all meaning and sort of interpretation of the world. And I went through that as well, and I've seen many people go through it. And the thing about it, I think it's the only thing that seems to erase that or address that sort of because I want to say pathology, but it's not inherently pathological if it's part of the normal developmental process. But the only thing that sort of addresses that and brings it into balance is experience. And I think that's part of the issue, is that it's very rare when you're that young that you have much experience. Your world experience is very limited. And so you feel you have a reasonable level of mastery of the aspects of the world that you understand, but you're just not aware of how much of the world there is that you don't know anything about. Yeah. And it can be quite sad, because I know people who are in their 30s, 40s, 50s who haven't grown out of this phase and still believe that the world is a lot more simple than it is, and that they have all the answers to it.
Is that a bad thing though? Because that sort of comes back around to this. I was having this conversation with Dad the other day actually, about how ignorance is bliss in many ways. Like, you look at people with like higher IQs and people who think more deeply about the world, you tend to have much higher rates of loneliness and depression and stuff like that. So being able to live your life basically oblivious to the fact that the world doesn't revolve around you, it usually ends up in people being able to be, I would argue, probably more consistently happier, just living their life and getting on with things. Because like I noticed, especially me, like the more I thought about the bad stuff in the world, I've tend to shift my deep thought processes towards like consciousness and like things that interest me now. But before, I was always thinking about like war, politics, all those sorts of things. I was so unhappy, like literally so miserable. So being able to sort of live your life in that small bubble and just sort of get on with it is, I would argue, potentially a good thing. Not for the people around you, but for yourself. Like, it's great.
I think that this is sort of skirting along one of the rules that I found that I've learnt to use more in recent times, and I think what you're sort of getting at runs very parallel with this, which is Law 9, which says, "Win through your actions, never through argument."
I've got that one written down on my
You've got it down as well. And this, to me, I think previously I was a much bigger believer in argumentation and the fact that the idea that you could convince people through talking things through or presenting evidence and so on and so forth. And admittedly, when I first adopted that approach, I didn't have that much evidence or good argumentation or anything like that. I wouldn't say I was a sophisticated thinker back then. I would hope that I'm more sophisticated now,
I was going to make a
and
joke about that,
I think I have a long way to go, and I'm still developing that. But one of the things that I realised is that often people aren't interested in arguments. There's that.
but
There was something I heard a little while ago. It was, arguing with someone on the internet is like playing chess with a pigeon. It doesn't matter who won; they're still going to shit all over the place and walk around like they own it,
yeah,
or something like that. And what I have found is the best way to influence others in a direction that you would want is for you to be an example of that. You have to
yeah,
model it and hold yourself to a high standard. And with any luck, some people will see that it's garnering results and feel inspired to mimic it. And I think that within that, there's also the being one of the things that I try to model is being open and acknowledging my limitations and my flaws,
yeah.
because in doing that, you encourage that in others, and that creates more of a growth mindset where they're sort of able to be wrong and to recognize that there is a way to be better, and that is in some essence the main calling, the main meaning of life is to see how can I be better and how much better can I get before I die.
I think, and that, in terms of the meaning of life thing, I think that's very much a subjective thing. I agree with you in terms of both of us, and in terms of a lot of people that I know, it is very much trying to have a growth mindset and being a better person. And I like to surround myself with people like that. But I think there's plenty of people that would disagree with that meaning of life and lean towards I suppose things like enjoyment and money. It doesn't matter if you're a better person as long as you're making loads of money. It doesn't
Yeah.
matter if you're improving yourself as long as you sort of like live fast and die young. And then you've got drug addicts that just have a meaning of life for just taking drugs. And
Well, you're sort of talking about either hedonism, which is the sort of excessive indulgence, or nihilism, which is there is no meaning, I'll do what I want.
yeah,
But I would argue that if you actually look at, I don't think that it's an entirely subjective meaning of life, because I think that if you look at the outcomes for people who sort of adopt a nihilistic approach to it, are they happy? Because they don't seem like they've got a lot of meaning in their life. The whole sort of their worldview is that there is no meaning. And the hedonists, are they happy? They might be in the short term. Are they happy in the long term? And people who you sort of say would use money as a marker of success or something like that, and the pursuit of money as their meaning, I would argue that when you really look at it and sort of speak to them, it's not the money that is the thing that makes them happy. It's the um, achievement and the attainment and the sort of being good at what they do in order to make that. And the money is just a proxy for indicating to them how well they're doing at what they're doing.
yeah, yeah. No, that's definitely true. But like, I suppose like what you can really boil it down to then is just meaning of life being whatever makes you happy. Realistically, think about it, because what you were saying there is just like, are the hedonists, are they happy, or the nihilists, are they happy? Like, if you're looking at that, it's just, it all boils down to happiness, which I think is a very, very good way of gauging quality of life is probably the right way to put it, but not the way I wanted to word it. But I can't think of the right word, so that's going to have to do. But yeah, happiness being the best measurement of life, I guess, and meaning to life.
I wouldn't say it's happiness. I would say that the happiness is a consequence of pursuing meaning rather than happiness being the meaning itself.
Yeah,
Because lots of people will find meaning in things that involve a reasonable amount of discomfort and suffering in the process, but they will feel more satisfied over the long run because they feel a sense of purpose and meaning and responsibility within that. It reminds me of when we spoke about Viktor Frankl and Man's Search for Meaning, when
yeah,
he talks about the Jews in the concentration camps who would go around comforting others and giving them their last bit of food, even when it was often a chaotic environment where people were stealing from one another and treating each other poorly. That basically those who had some external sense of meaning beyond their happiness were able to withstand more suffering, and they were more satisfied with their circumstances regardless of what those circumstances were.
yeah. I think that's yeah. Okay, so fuck happiness. It's all about meaning. But yeah, no, you're definitely right. I think it is definitely more about meaning. But then like you can look at people with sort of like the hedonists doing things like partying and doing very selfish things, and their meaning is essentially bringing joy by doing shitty things. Like, so
But but
it's a
but
difficult one.
this is my point. Is that meaningful in the long run, or is that just, how many of those people are just avoiding something because they're afraid of what it would mean to change their life and to do something differently and all the connotation, because it's not easy. So like to sort of commit yourself to being a better person,
No,
you
it's
have
not.
to be very prepared to acknowledge that you're not a good person now and that you could be better. You have to acknowledge that there are parts of you that are insufficient,
Yeah.
and you have to be willing to let those parts of you die, for lack of a better word.
See, this is something that I've spoken to a fair amount of people about. Is the fact that I was very much convinced for a long time, and I still think about it like a lot now. Is that I was like, I was a bad person. Like I did a lot of very shitty things, and uh, like Mum, Hazel, all that would be like, no, you're a good person. Like you got like really good sides to you and stuff like that. And it's just like, yeah, but I need to accept that these parts of me were there, and I was doing these things. And I'm sure I've still got shitty parts of me now. Like I'm not.
I was
Um,
going to say, you should have come to me. I'll tell you all the flaws. I'm not sugarcoating it.
um, but yeah, no, it's kind of like being able to accept the negatives of your doing and the impact you have on other people and stuff like that, and being able to uh, I mean, no one's good or bad. Like it's way too black and white to look at it like that. You definitely have like good and bad elements in everyone.
The
Uh,
line between good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being,
Something like that.
oscillates back and forth.
um, but yeah, no, it's very much. I was being able to reflect on the shitty things I've done and being able to be like, right, I was a bad person. I did bad things at that point. Uh, was very much like a sort of healing process in a sense, because I was able to be like, yeah, that was wrong. Like I shouldn't have done that. Um, and yeah, being able to sort of accept that it's kind of like it's a human element of you, isn't it? Being able to reflect on your wrongdoings and being able to correct, or not even correct those issues, but correct uh, the behaviours of future you. And
I think it's about accountability, but I'm curious from what you're sort of saying, what that accountability process looked like for you.
um, well, most of the things that I couldn't go back and be like, I couldn't fix them, like the
Yeah,
things that I've already done. So like the accountability process was more me just thinking about it and for a few days being like, damn, I'm an asshole. and then just being like kind of coming back to, well, it's something that I always come back to is like, I can't predict the future, I can't change the past. The only thing I can do is like focus on the present. So like It's like, right, I won't, I won't be like that in the future, but I can't change the things that I've already done. So
Mm.
I just need to continue moving forward and try my best not to do the things that I did before, or like do things that would hurt people and things like that.
Was there ever any sort of process of atonement? Because obviously you can't change the past, but um, you can do things to try and change the way people view it, or to sort of because what I'm thinking of is there's been a number of occasions in my life where I've sort of had many years to reflect on things where I've fallen short, and that has had a negative impact on people that I care about. And I've gone back many years later to say, look, I know this is probably something that you haven't even considered for many years, but maybe it is, and I don't know. But I just wanted you to know, with no sort of other expectation other than me wanting you to know this, that I have thought about it over the past few years, and I recognise that what I did wasn't right and wasn't fair on you, and I'm sorry for that. And I've found when I've done that that it's often deepened my relationships with people, and I've felt it's been a really positive experience. There have been people who just aren't interested in that conversation whatsoever, and that is what it is. And you can't expect people, it's you can only take accountability for your side of things. But I'm just curious if there's been anything like that where you've sort of tried to make peace with
Uh,
the past.
See, this isn't a conversation that I've had in my head many and many times. Obviously, I've done it with mum. Like all the horrible things I've done with mum, I've done to mum. I've spoken to her about. I've apologized. Like, obviously, now me and mum have a healthy relationship and stuff like that. So like, it's all good. But when I think about it in terms of messaging people, I'm just like, am I? Is this sort of like a, I want to say selfish, but that I don't think that's the right word. Am I just doing this to make myself feel better, or am I doing it for them? And if I'm doing it purely to make myself feel better, why am I dragging things back up for them?
Mm.
If you know what I mean. Um, and obviously it depends on the severity of the situation. The worst things I've done in my life, I've spoken to the people that I've done them to, and like sort of fix them. But like most of them was when I was like very young, like 14, 15. But yeah, it's more like when I'm thinking of the little things, like accidentally ghosting someone who I was speaking to, or like just maybe making like a sly comment by accident and not realizing that it was a sly comment. I'm just like, am I doing this for selfish reasons? Like, is it purely to pat myself on the back and be like, yeah, you fixed it, sort of thing? Which to me, I just feel like even more of an asshole for like putting these people through things, or like speaking to people and putting them in a potentially awkward situation just to pat myself on the back. I'm like,
Well, this is always a difficult situation. And I've had that same conversation with myself on many occasions. It's like, am I, particularly after I had a couple of experiences like that, and I was like, oh, that worked out really positive and really developed these relationships and things like that. I'm like, am I motivated to do it again because I
oh
felt good
gosh,
after the
yeah,
last one? And am I actually just exercising another form of self-indulgence?
exactly.
And is it selfish? But I think the conclusion I've come to is that the way to mitigate that, or to protect against that, is to have no expectation of the other person's response, to um and to be sincere in it. If
Yeah,
you are apologizing for something, but you think the other person maybe did something wrong within that process as well, and that it wasn't 100% on you, um, you can say something within that, like, I think there are things we both could have handled better, but I want to apologize for my part.
Yeah.
because because otherwise there's the risk that you're sort of setting it up and saying, oh, I'm apologizing to you. Okay, now here's the floor for you to apologize to me.
Yeah.
And then feeling upset when they don't apologize back to you, and so. But I think that, like I said, not everyone has accepted those apologies from me. I had one not that long ago where the person I apologized to blocked me without responding to the message. And I thought, at first I was a little bit upset by that, and then I thought, no, this is their choice. I've given them an honest account of my feelings and my thoughts, and what they want to do with that is up to them, and it's not for me to decide a priori how they're going to feel about something.
Yeah, but even still, like in my brain, that's me being like, I can pat myself on the back because I apologize. It doesn't matter what they do now. Like that still to me sounds like I'm just giving myself an out. And
Don't pat yourself on the back then.
No, but like, I'm not obviously physically just there this afternoon sending a message like, good boy, like keep them up. But there's something I was going to say, but it's completely slipped out of my mind.
Sorry, that's my fault.
That's all good. I mean, I much prefer coming back to the book.
What book?
Rule number 16: use absence to increase respect and honour. So there you go. Anyone I've done wrong, they're definitely respecting and honouring me. I probably got a few shrines.
I'm staying out your way so that you like me again.
Exactly. There you go. It's I'm hoarding power over these people that I've fucked over. Oh, Jesus Christ. Yeah, not a good look, is it?
Well, there is none amongst us who are innocent.
Yeah.
It's the famous "Let he who's out without sin cast the first stone."
Yeah. Keeping your hands clean, isn't it?
One of them that I found very interesting, I believe it was Law 27. Yeah. Play on people's need to believe to create a cult-like following.
Are you planning on creating a cult-like following with this podcast?
That's exactly it. That's why I found it interesting. So if anyone would like to join my cult... No, I thought this was really interesting, and someone else pointed this out to me who just coincidentally happened to be reading the book at the same time. That it plays out in society a lot.
Yeah.
And I think I'd have to go back to it. Exactly, what's it on? Page 106. This concise version is so useful.
Yeah, I wish I read that one rather than the 470 pages of the other one.
So it had steps to creating a cult. Step 1 was keep it vague, keep it simple.
Yeah.
Step 2, emphasize.
Stop with the first one, to be fair.
No, because I'm not creating a cult. That was a joke, remember? Emphasize the visual and sensual over the intellectual. Step 3, borrow the forms of organized religion to structure the group. Step 4, disguise your source of income. Step 5, set up an us versus them dynamic. And that seemed very potent in today's. So,
Which bit?
The whole thing. But when we spoke at the start, you felt that Robert Greene's intentions were more about giving people a psychopathic guide to wielding power.
Yeah.
I interpreted it like that, but actually when I've used it, when I've sort of really thought about it, everything that I was thinking about was examples of like, oh, actually there's something going on in this situation, there's something going on in this situation. So it did give me a lens through which to view other people's actions.
Yeah.
And I feel like I've seen this rule play out loads in recent times. Um, so an example could be like Black Lives Matter.
Yeah.
That's a nice vague statement. It's sort of hard to disagree with, but what does it actually mean in practical terms? That's vague. Um, Using the structures of sort of religion, they had ceremonies, they had their rituals, like the taking the knee, the putting the black square on your thing. You had to have these symbolic representations. So again, it's using the visual over the intellectual. There was lots of symbolism there was lots of ritual to it. Associated with that, you had sort of slogans and chanting and all this sort of things that was ritualistic about it. Disguise your source of income. Well, we know that the people who sort of established Black Lives Matter turned out to be millionaires who basically took the funds from Black Lives Matter to buy themselves mansions and live in gated communities and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I've forgotten what the fifth one was now, creating us versus them. And there's no doubt that they did that. And they had loads of ideas that were foolish and not even necessarily supported by the majority of black people, like defund the police, when it turned out that 2/3 of black people in the areas where that was actually being considered didn't support that as a policy, but they were sort of making out like. So there's this, and I use BLM because I think that it was an obvious example.
Yeah.
But I think there are loads of examples of this playing out.
Russia versus Ukraine as well. Because Russia spent ages basically forcing propaganda on over like TV and stuff like that about how Ukraine needed help and things like that, and sort of creating like a us versus them, as well as using symbolism, obviously the adverts and the propaganda, and that was going to have images and videos and whatnot, a kind of vagueness about what's actually happening in Ukraine. Without a doubt, you could probably end up applying it to Israel and Palestine as well.
I was thinking that as you were saying it, I think it's probably more obvious in the Israel and Palestine thing, because I don't know if you've watched any of them, but I've seen videos of people interviewing people at these allegedly pro-Palestinian marches, where they've had their chants, they've had their symbols, they have the scarves, that the word for which is escaping me at this point in time, and they would chant things like, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, right, meaning from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea. And when people were asking them, so what does that chant mean, or what's it mean, people would they wouldn't have any idea what it actually means. And if you ask them about the specifics of how, if they did say, oh, well, Palestine should be liberated from the River Jordan to the Mediterranean Sea, then they were able to give that level of articulation. Then you would ask, well, how would that be achieved? And none of them would know. And certainly none of them would acknowledge that it would involve that the process would involve wiping out all of the Jews between and sort of or getting rid of Israel as a whole. And there is a very strong us versus them, like really, really strong.
With that example, especially if you're talking about looking at pro-Palestine being the cult side of things, it's bound to happen, because it's tugging on like a lot of heartstrings. Like, obviously they're getting bombed to shit, and there's like loads of people are dying, and that children are dying, and it's all very tragic in a sense. So I think it's going to be a lot easier to create that sort of momentum when there is a visual representation of actual suffering and stuff like that, and also use
symbolism and whatever the other word was, and instead of intellectual arguments, it's the step 2 of creating a cult-like following was not to rely on the intellectual arguments, but to use that. And the interesting thing about that is that the whole reason that's been possible, the sort of PR war, is basically because of the level of restraint that Israel's been showing, where they've been going to more lengths than any army has ever done historically to encourage civilians to evacuate areas before targeting them, and they've been setting up humanitarian camps to facilitate that, and they've been doing all this stuff that's time consuming, and like I think it was about 3 weeks before they launched their first proper attack against Hamas. And in that time, the PR machine's able to sort of whirl and create these visual representations which lose them the PR war. And it's one of the interesting paradoxes of this war is that Israel's restraint has allowed them to be made to look worse in many occasions.
I mean, to be fair, I generally don't know enough about it politically to.
Oh no,
start.
I'm very limited in my knowledge of it as well. But
To be fair, I just see. Obviously, all I've seen is just the people died and shit, and I'm just like, that's not cool. But
yeah,
but yeah, no, it's this is it though. Like, I think that people will see things like that happening, and the average person doesn't understand politics or anything like that. Like they just understand it on a very surface level. They don't understand like the actual like international relationships of politics, and they definitely, like the majority of them, definitely don't understand the politics around the relationship between Israel and Palestine.
it's only one of the most complicated
Yeah,
international relations.
I tried reading about it once, and I was just like, this is just confusing the fuck out of me. So yeah, I am one of those people. I'll happily admit that. But it generally just fuck. I don't like my brain. Like, but yeah, most people don't understand it, and then they see bad things happening, and they're just like, bad things shouldn't be happening, so they take to the streets and they start marching and things like that. And I agree with them, but it's all very much emotional, and it seems very simple from the outside. And then when you start getting into the nitty gritty of it, it's not simple, because all these countries and stuff have weapons of mass destruction and nuclear bombs, and they have leaders who are psychopaths and will pretty much do anything to gain and keep power and things like that. And it becomes difficult, and it's the same sort of stuff around like China, and how, like, I don't know much about it, but I know China's got like Muslim concentration camps at the minute. And
Yeah, the Uyghur Muslims.
yeah, and just no one gives a shit because it's China, and China's powerful. And like everyone's so focused on Israel and Palestine. And then what's the country that the UK is currently providing weapons to, like cause like a famine in? It's like an African country or something like that. Yemen.
Yeah.
So the UK is providing weapons to basically keep essentially attacking Yemen. I don't know. Again, I don't know much about it.
Yeah.
But I know that it's a horrible thing, and then people are just like, people will notice it, and they'll be like, "Oh, that's bad." But don't see anyone much in the streets like there or anything like that. It's kind of just it's we get fed information, and we get fed the things that they want to feed us, and most people are too ignorant and lack the ability to think critically. Me too. I don't bother reading about most of these things other than the very surface level, and then it basically ends up us reacting emotionally to the things that they want us to react to, in a sense.
I don't think it's as one-sided as that makes it sound. I think that yes, I think that there's a feedback loop effect where it's almost like a mimetic process where certain news stories are put out there, and some of them gain traction for whatever reason.
Yeah.
I think in the case of Israel Palestine, it plays on two things. It sort of plays on a dormant sort of level of anti-Semitism which exists within the culture. I think it also plays on the oppressed sort of narrative that has been predominating in the West for a while now,
Yeah.
where people very easily fit this narrative of Israel bad, Palestine good, Israel oppressor, Palestine oppressed onto it. Um, and so I think those two things mean that any story between Israel and Palestine is going to gain more traction than a story about the Uyghur Muslims or about any of the other sort of genocides or conflicts that have occurred. And I don't use the word genocide to imply that there's a genocide going on in Israel or Palestine, because that is not um, something I believe to be the case based on what I've seen, but it's also something that's not been decided by.
What's the definition of genocide again? Is that like
A genocide would be a deliberate attempt to wipe out a population of people. So they would be having to, for it to be a genocide against the Palestinians, there would have to be reasonable evidence that they were trying to wipe out the Palestinians as a people,
rather than just trying to fight
rather than just
Hamas?
trying to fight Hamas.
Right. Okay.
And
I
within
can
that,
see how that would be taken.
yeah, and
Yeah.
within that, you have to account for the fact that Hamas are exploiting international law to hide themselves within civilian populations and make bases in hospitals, because you can't bomb hospitals according to international law and all these things. So Hamas are making it very difficult for Israel to conduct a war that doesn't look bad.
I mean, fair play to them. That's good power play and good tactics. Like they've
Yeah,
clearly been
Robert
reading
Greene
this
would be
book.
proud. But yeah, I think that for some reason a story takes hold, and when a story takes hold, the media go, "Well, hey, we've got loads of attention. Let's run 10,000 more stories along those lines." And you saw it early on in the Israel-Palestine conflict. There was a BBC journalist who put out a story saying that Israel had bombed a hospital and killed 500 people.
Yeah.
That hadn't been confirmed at the time that he published this, and it later turned out that the Palestinian Authority were caught on camera firing a rocket towards Israel that had misfired and hit a car park outside of the hospital, killing a small number of people, and that Israel hadn't been involved in the process at all. And then later on, the journalist who'd published this lie that Israel had bombed a hospital and killed 500 people was interviewed and asked if he regretted his decision. And he said, "No, I don't regret my decision. I posted what I thought was the case at the time." And it's like, so with that level of accountability, and that's an institutional issue. If they don't believe that publishing misinformation, without publishing information without careful consideration, because people are going to be mistaken at different times, and I don't like the term misinformation because some people will label everything that disagrees with them as misinformation.
Well, misinformation needs to be defined, really, doesn't it? Is in like information that is deliberately misleading. Like, yeah, you can't just, if something is objectively true, you can't be this is information misinformation because
the camera's just turned off.
Yeah.
So I've lost what I was saying, but I think my point was that it's not just that there are people deciding what to feed to people. It seems to be an interplay between what is known will gain traction and gain attention versus what people give their attention to. And so the media are just responding to the incentives that are created by the public, but then the public are responding to the process created by the media, and so you've got this feedback loop between them.
It's a supply and demand issue. If you're able to, like, the more demand there is on certain news articles, the more they're going to produce it, because the way they make money is interaction through their articles and things like that. So if they can exploit news articles that are going to gain traction, it's like this kid who's gone missing in Tenerife, right?
Yeah.
there is a kid in Bristol who's been missing for 17 weeks. Same
Mm.
age, similar sort of story, but he's in Bristol when he went missing, so it doesn't matter. Whereas this kid goes missing in Tenerife, and all of a sudden everyone's just like, oh my god, this kid's gone missing abroad. Like, and they have printed loads of news articles about it, but they'd like, everyone's forgotten about the kid that's missing in Bristol, and he was only had traction for like a few days, and it was only local. It never got like national or anything like that. So um, I think in that case they're more preying on people's fears. Because people go on holiday, and like being injured or lost on holiday is a lot more scary than being like someone going
Yeah.
missing in like the local place. Um, so they posted a few articles. It got a lot more traction because it's a kid missing abroad, and now they're just printing them and printing them and printing them. So it's if there's demand for these stories, then they will literally do it until the demand drops. And as soon as people stop clicking it so often, then they'll start looking for other things, and they'll start being like, right, what's the next big thing that we can get clicks off? And that creates a very dangerous element in society, because it essentially means that as soon as a higher portion of the population start engaging in this media, everyone will engage with it, because it starts creating like it'll pop up on more people's news feeds, it'll pop up as top stories and stuff like that constantly, and then everyone gets all their information from very similar news articles. Obviously it would be, since say the BBC posted something and it gains a lot of traction and it gets to a top story, then obviously everyone else is going to start doing the same thing, and you're going to get like the Guardian posting similar stuff, but they're going to have their own twists on it, and it'll basically essentially end up being whatever news source that you're looking at will then dictate your opinion on that, but it will always be whatever one's gained the most traction. So it's sort of it is, I would argue that, especially with the amount of media that we consume through social media and like TV and stuff like that, we are essentially constantly being manipulated into believing whatever they want, like whatever the, I suppose, the most popular opinion is, rather than whatever the truth is. And if you're creating money for the company, that the newspaper company that you're writing for, then misinformation doesn't matter, does it? Like,
Well, it makes me think of like how algorithms work, because people, I've heard calls recently from people saying you should ban algorithms, and I don't even.
that doesn't really make sense, does it?
No, it doesn't make sense, because you couldn't ban algorithms, because it's just the means by which it connects different interests. Even
start banning math next.
yeah, but it sort of, it works on finding out where the attention. Basically, most algorithms will promote the thing that gains the most interest and is the most likely to keep you engaged. So it basically is like, you're interested in these things, so we're going to show you these things, so you're going to keep getting interested in these things, and it's that feedback loop dynamic. And it doesn't strike me that we're particularly well adapted to the social media environment, and I think that it's a double-edged sword, but I'm increasingly convinced that the negatives outweigh the positives.
Have you seen how they've started to adapt algorithms to basically affect comment sections as well? So it's not just a case of it's showing you what posts you're more likely to interact with, it's now showing you what comments you're also more likely to interact with. So if you, the most prominent, I'm sure you've probably seen this, the man versus bear thing, not like man versus bear, but women choosing a man or a bear. Like, in the comment section, women are much more likely to be shown comments of men getting arsey about it, because they are more likely to have a negative response to it, and then they're gonna basically interact with those comments and then create more comments in this cycle. And then men are more likely to see women react badly to it, because that's more likely to get them like enraged and stuff like that. So you can have two people sat next to each other looking at exactly the same video. Like if you share a video to someone else on TikTok, they will see different top comments to the ones that you do. Um, and you can use the filter that says for you comments and like newest and stuff like that. But most of the time, it's still going to show you different ones. Like 'cause it's going to be catering to your taste in a sense. And if you're not watching the video, I just did air quotation marks to taste. Uh, but yeah, it's incredibly dangerous. It's we're essentially just creating people who can't think for themselves, and I think the negatives of social media at this point far outweigh the positives. To, like you said, essentially.
Yeah, and I think that I think that to take it back to the book and then wrap up, I think that what I took away from Rule 27, from the one we're talking about in terms of the creating a cult-like following, is be aware of how easy it is to fall into the trap of that sort of cult-like following, and don't. I guess over recent years, I've learned to have a skepticism of the big
Cults.
thing, of the sort of the next big thing, whatever is sort of, if everyone on my social media is outraged by one thing, then the first thing in my head the sort of mental process does is goes, okay, this seems very one-sided. What's the other position, and what am I missing here? Because I know that without that process, it's very easy to get carried away and be completely misguided about something.
Yeah.
And it frustrates me when I see people who I know who are good people, who are very intelligent and capable people, who are sharing and voicing opinions that they clearly haven't thought through at all. And I'm like, that's, yeah, it saddens me. But I mean, I'm sure that people could find plenty of examples of me doing the same.
Yeah. Well, this is the thing that I always sort of think about around this is that you have to recognise, if you were living in Nazi Germany at the time, you would have probably voted for the Nazis, because that's how they got into power. And you can't just you can't just believe everything that people are telling you and just follow what everyone sort of has an idea for, because you're just going to end up in a dangerous situation where people can take advantage of you.
Yeah, and I think it was the same in the Soviet Union. I think it was something like 1 in 3 citizens was a informant to the government, or something like that. It was insane. And yeah, people, I mean, it goes back to something we said much earlier on, but when people don't recognize their own potential to sort of subconsciously play out these power games and these power dynamics, then they are just going to be blind to their own potential to play them out.
Yep, pretty much.
That seems like the spot to end it. I'll just have to edit round the video, but that will be a headache for another day. Right, thank you.
Thank you.
And now I leave you with a quote from Abraham Lincoln. Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you wish to test a man's character, give him power. Thank you.